Hey there, folks. Mark Edwards here, and you're watching the Ultraviolet podcast. And today, I have the pleasure of bringing you One Dime. One Dime is a socialist YouTuber who I've been following for a few months now, and whose work I really enjoy. He has a number of really well-researched, excellently produced videos that I think everybody should check out, and I was really excited to get him on the show. In the interview itself, we talk about the differences between liberal and social democratic economics and politics versus actual leftist politics and economics. We talk about modern monetary policy and the deficit myth, which is the subject of One Dime's latest video, which should be available at the time that this podcast is released. We then talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, which is automation and artificial intelligence and the way that that will impact the labor movement in the future, and why the development of machines and computer programs that can do much of the work that the current labor force is capable of doing requires that we very quickly start making changes in our society before the mechanism by which the labor force, the working class, can exert change on the world, which is withholding our labor, is no longer a tool that we have available to us. Those of you watching on YouTube will notice that this is an audio-only podcast. One Dime has some security concerns. He doesn't want his face on the internet right now, which I'm always perfectly happy to accommodate. So you'll see our logos and like an audio spectrum effect. For those of you listening on the podcast, obviously this won't change anything. Overall, it was a really fun conversation. I was really happy to have One Dime on the show, and I will not keep you from him any longer. So without any further delay, I give you One Dime. All right, One Dime, thank you for joining me. How are you doing, man?
I'm pretty good. How about you? I'm happy to be on.
Yeah, I'm doing good. Happy to have you. So I started watching your videos probably about like 3 or 4 months ago, I think. And I really, really dig your content. It's very well researched, very well produced. And I think recently you made a video, and we'll probably talk about this, where you touched on a subject that is close to my heart and did a much better job with it, which is the future of automation and its relationship to capital and socialism. But
right.
I want to just kind of introduce yourself, tell everybody who you are and how you got into making YouTube videos and doing what you do.
So I'm by and large pretty much a socialist YouTuber. I'd say leftist YouTuber, but I say socialist YouTuber just to kind of be a little more clear as to what specific ideological tendency. I don't usually like to label myself one way or the other. I am very much into Marxism, but I don't identify with a specific Marxist label or anything. So I run the channel One Dime. I basically make videos on political economy, critical theory, pretty much kind of using these things to explain broader issues. I like to use a lot of books to kind of back up what I'm saying or to inform what I'm saying. Sometimes I'll use a pop culture topic, as in with my early videos, to kind of maybe elucidate a certain issue. And yeah, my goal is pretty much to really help those who are either on the fence or looking to learn about these sort of issues from a leftist perspective, things that impact our everyday life. Like, for instance, my upcoming video that'll be coming out in a week or so is on modern monetary theory, but it's called the deficit myth, kind of debunking the idea that how are you going to pay for it? The question that always arises whenever progressives want any sort of basic program, like, I don't know, not having homeless people, climate change, etc., and about inflation and all that sort of stuff. And as you mentioned, the last video was about automation and sort of 4 possible futures that both automation and a world ravaged by climate change could possibly take us in, exploring 4 different possibilities. And I find that kind of interesting, all that stuff. So if I were to recommend any video, it'd probably be that one you mentioned, as well as I would say the Burnout Society. That's a big one of mine, as well as meme warfare. That's probably a personal favorite.
Yeah, and I'm also actually partial to acid communism is another
Oh
favorite
yeah.
of mine that you did, which relates to some things that are close to my heart. Um, and maybe we can talk about that a
For
little
sure.
later as well too. But before we get into all that, because I want to talk to you in depth about all those topics. But maybe I always like to hear people's sort of like journey into leftism and how they came to have the politics that they have. So, how did you wind up being a socialist? Like, were you born a socialist? Did you come out of the womb with a copy of Capital, or was it a journey that you had to take?
I was born in the womb of Rosa Luxemburg, and then that's how I became. No, um, I mean, I was my family was largely kind of liberals, so I kind of grew up in a fairly liberal environment. Um, I went through a brief phase when I was like a teenager of embracing conservatism and
Hmm.
stuff like that, just to kind of rebel. But then I noticed because I was never socially conservative. I always thought social conservatism was kind of dumb. Like,
Hmm.
why have rules, unnecessary rules on things? Like, why can't we just have fun? Okay, guys. But one thing I used to buy into when I was like a teenager was this whole fiscal responsibility nonsense. And then all it really took is I ended up trying to look up facts to see, this is why the conservatives, I live in Canada, so I was looking at the Canadian conservatives as to why they're more fiscally responsible. And I actually saw that the conservatives run bigger deficits and
Hmm.
by and large run worse economic growth, even in a capitalistic sense than, liberals. And I was like, oh, that's a bunch of nonsense. And I kind of started to gravitate more on like what I thought was important issues. I sort of gravitated a bit to I would say progressive liberal politics in Canada. I got really into the NDP. This is kind of when I was maybe late teens, um, and stuff. The NDP, for those who don't know, in Canada, the New Democrat Party. I would say they're kind of like a not even a social democrat party, but maybe like Elizabeth Warren type of politics, something like that. Welfare capitalism,
Hmm.
and you believe in essential things like, okay, why do we have homeless people on the street? Should there be less inequality? Basic stuff like that. Climate change becomes an issue. Obviously, you see a lot of holes in the system, but and then probably when I was later on, I got really into Bernie Sanders, and I never really I was brainwashed to be very against socialism throughout
Hmm.
all my high school curriculum. Like all the teachers were even the sometimes more liberal leaning ones would disassociate anything socialism with totalitarianism and whatnot.
Hmm.
And I got into Bernie Sanders in 2016, and I was like, I agree with a lot of this guy's ideas, so I guess I'm a democratic socialist. And people who used to argue against me, they should call me a socialist. I'm like, okay, if that makes me a socialist, I guess I am. Um, and kind of like the sort of naive progressive liberal when Bernie lost in 2016, kind of controversially against Hillary with all those the voter suppression in New York and all that weird
Hmm.
nonsense, I kind of became very skeptical, and that hits you with a pill of nihilism. Sometimes I think that's necessary because then I started exploring a lot of things on YouTube, Noam Chomsky, Richard Wolff, Michael Parenti, all sort of stuff like that, and I got really into I guess you could say social. I went through like a little anarchist phase, and I went into Marxism. When I got really into critical theory, which I do more seriously, like when I became a sort of theory nerd like I am now, was more because I was writing my bachelor's thesis in my fourth year, and I was writing it on the rise of the far right. I was
Hmm.
seeing stuff that was happening around 2017, 2018, I was like really surprised by all of this. And I looked into the Frankfurt School conspiracy theories, the cultural Marxism and all that stuff. And they were saying, oh, there's this plot to destroy capitalism and bring. And I was looking at the Frankfurt School and I thought, wow, you know what? These guys are based. And I thought Antonio Gramsci, and he's not part of the Frankfurt School, but he's
Right.
associated with being before that, kind of influencing them. I was like, you know what, this is all really interesting, and I looked up stuff about that, and then I started buying a bunch of books, and kind of ever since then, it's only got more and more, got more and more into this stuff, more into history and critical theory since then, and wasn't until probably like 2.5, 3 years that I started making videos on it. And because I felt like I had something to say, because I started seeing all these things in pop culture, and I felt I could, explain this thing in a better way with this theory, right? Or this economics, whatnot. So yeah, I guess to make a long story short, that's how I'd sum it up.
Yeah, that I'm always kind of I guess maybe envy isn't the right word, but I really am I have like an admiration for people that can dive into theory that way. It's one of the reasons I like your content is because you do a good job explaining it. And I'm kind of attracted to the channels and accounts that do that. St. Andrew is another one who does a good job with that. But I I have like really bad ADD, and like I can't get through these. It's like reading some of this stuff is like eating flour, and I can do audiobooks, which I've been getting
Oh,
better
I
at.
have some tips for that if you want, because
Yeah, absolutely.
I was actually, I don't know if I should reveal this, but yeah, I essentially have ADD pie, and I struggled with that a long time. I used to not even read books really
Hmm.
until I got into leftism, and even then it was kind of hard. So I find easy way to do it is actually first watch lectures, then listen to podcasts, YouTube videos, and get, if you're going to get start with books, get like secondary sources,
Hmm.
good intro books. There's actually like these graphic guides. That's how when I first got into theory, I read these graphic guides
Hmm.
that like are like almost like comic books that explain the theory, and then after that I did audiobooks. I still by and large listen to a lot of my books through
Hmm.
I do audiobooks more than I do physical, but I do both. Once you get the material, it becomes kind of easier to focus on because you have an interest for it, and then like dopamine in your brain naturally
Yeah,
produces, and you're already sucked in, and you have like the terms there to kind of understand. Whereas imagine reading for the first time without that,
yeah.
being informed on that, it's like it's a lot of effort, and obviously even especially ADHD brain is not going to want to read that. So it's the thing I hate when people say, oh, want to get radicalized, read Marx. Like, no, do not read Marx. Marx is like maybe the Communist Manifesto, that's pretty interesting, but don't read Capital is extremely boring. Don't read that until you're like really ready, because it's super boring. Or don't read the postmodernists. It's
That
going to be
actually,
hard.
like, just in terms of methodology, that mirrors some how I got through a lot of when I went through like a moral philosophy phase where I was really into reading about that. I would create a podcast playlist where it was like 5 or 6 different people talking about the same philosopher and their theories, and I'd listen to that while I worked out, and then I'd read like the what is it, the Stanford Encyclopedia article on their stuff, and then I'd get a bunch of overviews of their theories, and then I would try to read the primary source. So I may approach it from that angle too, because that worked out fairly well for me. Um, in so much as like I was able to get through a few of the
Yeah.
classics.
Those Stanford EDU articles can be useful. It's kind of funny. One thing to look out for is be careful of some YouTubers who overly simplify philosophy and
Hmm.
theory. Like there's some really pop channels that literally read off of the Stanford EDU
Yeah,
type pages, and you can tell if you dug deep into it, and I hate that personally, but it's good. Like if one is learning, like if one's a learner as opposed to the teacher, it's totally useful.
yeah. Let's see. I can personally recommend "Philosophize This" is a good one for just people who are interested in philosophy. "Philosophers in Space," which is co-hosted by a friend of the show, Aaron Rabinowitz, and the there's a few others, but that's a little outside of the. There are good and bad people who are doing philosophy,
Hmm.
and like I think the like you said, if somebody sounds like they're just summarizing an article, then that's probably not what you want, unless that is what you want. But like I think it's better to get your info from somebody who has a rigorous understanding of the material themselves rather than just reading off a page.
The worst is the self help philosophy people who try to
Yeah.
make philosophers into these self help gurus. They'll be like Nietzsche, 10 ways you can be successful. I hate
Yeah.
that.
I have a really big beef with like the resurgence of like Neo-Stoicism.
Oh my
Uh
God, don't get me started on
like
stoicism,
because
bro.
I actually like I'm a fan of like the Stoics, like
Marcus
Seneca
Aurelius.
and Aurelius. Like there's good stuff in those books and in their teachings. There, I would actually recommend them to people who are interested in philosophy. But there is this element to Stoicism that if how can I put this non-conspiratorially? Um, if I were someone who wanted to create a populace who was completely uninterested in addressing systemic change in their world and turn them solely inward to being comfortable with the failures of the society around them, that failures which benefit me personally, I would fund a lot of people who preach a McDonald's version of stoicism where you
Yes.
just get on the grind and the hustle and you get after it mentality. Their stoicism with minimal tweaking is basically the perfect religion for slaves, right? Like you couldn't do better.
That's exactly what I was thinking too. Is I actually think that pop stoicism is a lot like secularized Calvinism.
Mm-hmm.
It's really like secularized the Protestant work ethic, pretty much
Yeah, which
turning
I think might be
inwards,
why it's
not
so
enjoying. Like
appealing
this
to
idea of
like
not enjoying. Like
yeah,
delay your enjoyment. Work and think for the future or whatever. And it's yeah,
which again, there are benefits to that. I think that you can extract value from that philosophy, and it's been personally very helpful. The way I usually like my heuristic is the person who is teaching you about stoicism also selling tactical bath wipes? And if they're selling you like gun rags or like prepper shit, or they're selling you their own self-help book, then that's probably not the person you should be learning Aurelius from.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So you kind of like got into, so you started reading theory and then commenting on kind of the world around you. What was, I noticed that I was looking back through your earlier content, and I think the earliest one that really like popped out to me, and I think might be a good entry point for like American listeners is why billionaires prefer Democrats,
oh
and
yeah,
I think that actually, like the stuff that you talk about in that video, I think really speaks to the systemic problems of capital in our political system and why um, so many people are disenchanted, and probably why so many people find themselves vulnerable to, say, like alt-right figures who are, they're giving them half of the truth, but not addressing the systemic critiques that you talk about in that video. But do you want to maybe like summarize the points in that video, because I think that's a good way to
sure.
onboard some people.
I mean, I don't know if I could completely summarize it other than tell people to watch it. But
Yeah, yeah.
basically, the reason I made that video was, well, I mean, anyone can really watch it, all backgrounds aside. But I would say I made it mostly for liberals, right
Hmm.
wingers too, because that's, it's titled "Why Billionaires Prefer Democrats" and a way to kind of trick right wingers into clicking it. But it's also for liberals because I think the whole way a lot of the American left views the political system, I'll say because I think what is being said in the video applies to most liberal bourgeois capitalist democracies.
Hmm.
So it definitely applies to Canada and the UK, but it's very much centered on the US. And in the US, I don't view is a democracy. The way I view the political system is sort of a competition between two highly paid fraternities as to who will manage the same system.
Yeah.
And because, for a political party to really have differences, they have to have a difference in ideology. And while it may look like there's a difference between these two parties, there's not such an ideological difference. It's really more what their roles in the broader system are. And I kind of explain this through Marxist theory of short-term and long-term interests of capitalism. Because what a lot of liberals, who might consider themselves social democrats or democratic socialists, fail to see is that they will see the Democrats as a lesser of two evils. And while they might be in terms of how their policies directly impact people, that's not what their intention is. It's not like they have a lesser evil ideology per se. It's more so that the Democrats look out for the longer term interests of capitalism, whereas Republicans are the shorter term interests of capitalism. You can look at Republicans, I guess, in a pop Freudian sense, perhaps like the id, and Democrats as the superego. And basically, the Republicans very much in the short term, huge tax breaks, corporate bailouts, wars for any interested parties. Like, the Iraq War was kind of risky even from like imperialist standpoint, because it was out of all of America's imperialist endeavors. There's been so many in the Middle East and in Latin America, especially. The Iraq was the most controversial, but it was really for the short-term interests of military contractor companies and oil companies. In the case of Dick Cheney literally had a big amount of shares in oil companies, which directly surged in value after the Iraq War. And there's actually the new movie with, I think, Christian Bale playing Dick Cheney that pretty much very well illustrates that. And even though, the Iraq War could have very irreversible long-term impacts for American foreign policy, I would argue it actually weakened the American empire long-term. Because now you see a lot of countries, like in Africa especially, are doing deals with China because they, frankly, rightly so, prefer China as a lesser evil than America, even though they're both effectively empires. They prefer China because they see what the U.S. Has done in Libya and in Iraq and Afghanistan. These are maybe in the short term good for capitalist interests. They're not good for the long term capitalist empire's interests, because people are going to be much more distrustful to America intervening in countries to open up markets. You can also look at something like regulations and taxes, which Democrats do, as protecting the long term interests of capital. Because when you have something like a full deregulation policy, like you can say George Bush Sr., and George Reagan, George Bush Sr., George Bush Jr., and to an extent Clinton, but more so the Bushes, who really had a strong tax cut and deregulation policy. What this does is it allows financial speculation to go completely rampant. Banks have far less regulations. And what this allows is, in the short term, profits, it's good for profits, right? But in the long term, it can completely collapse the system, as we saw in the 2008 crash. Democrats are usually better at actually keeping these things under control. Same with COVID, I would argue. Republicans usually just want to open up the economy right away, profit. Democrats, they'll be for more lockdowns, mask mandates, because they know in the longer term for businesses to do well, you have to get this virus out of the way. But it's just the point being is, it's not that the Democrats are just like better or more, have a better conscience or anything. They mainly just they're more competent managers of capitalism. And two, which I mentioned towards the end, is that they have voters that pressure them more. Republican voters are much more easily brainwashed into culture war nonsense. And Democrats will, not always, but especially the progressive wing of Democrat voters, will be much more, they'll pay much more attention to the Democrats and what they're doing and be more critical of them. So Democrats will have to do something, as we see with Biden's Build Back Better plan, which is largely kind of, pushed by the Sanders electorate. I don't think there would be that if it wasn't for Bernie Sanders' huge support in the primaries. So that's kind of largely the point there. And one thing I would say is, you can't just convince the Democrats to be better. And this is what people like Cenk Uygur, the Young Turks, Kyle Kalinske, a lot of these commentators totally get backwards, is they think, oh, we can push Biden to the left. We can push these Democrats to the left. What they don't get is the Democrats will only be pushed to the left if there's something that might threaten capitalism. threaten their donors and the system they oversee. So let's take huge workers' strikes, for example. If workers go on strike, especially in a key industry, they can, like, let's say mining, they will completely put the economy to a standstill, right? And that hurts capital. So then they have to do something. You don't just convince them. They're not, this isn't ethical. It's the way politics works is not in terms of pulling on one's conscience. It's about pulling on one's pockets. That's a better way to look at it. And so that's kind of, I try to look at it through a Marxist lens and whatnot. And I think this works very similarly in Canada too. But yeah, that's kind of largely the point. I think liberals will say, "Oh no, we have to worry only about the Republicans. They're evil. They're out of whatever." And then get in the Democrats, they're better. And then they'll say, "We'll pressure them after." It's like, no, I'm not. I don't. I think Biden was better than Trump, but you don't push Biden to the left by just voting for him immediately and just pledging allegiance to him a year before the election, like many of the left unfortunately did in America. You have to kind of get leverage. We're like, oh, we're not going to support you unless you do X. And once he is in power, you need more strikes, which we are kind of seeing now with during coronavirus, which is a good sign. But yeah, I think that's the point. Is it's not that you can't change it from the top down. You have to change from the bottom up.
Yeah, I think as I'm listening to you say all that, and I agree, I think broadly with most of it, there's something that keeps occurring to me, which is an interesting point, which is the point where you and I would criticize the Democratic Party, which is that they are acting in the long-term interests of capitalism and they're better managers of that system. That is how they sell themselves in many ways. That I find it amusing, darkly amusing, that the point at which many leftists will criticize liberals and Democrats is specifically on the points where they think of themselves highly. For instance, like we could take this back to, say, FDR, right, and the New Deal. In many ways, and I think you talk about this in the video, is FDR and the New Deal is sort of heralded and or talked about as this bright, shining moment of progress in American history. And in reality, in many ways, what it was is the death blow to the American labor movement at the time.
I would say death blow to the communist movement.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
That's a fair
actually, it kind of strengthened the labor movement to a certain extent, but it destroyed the communist movement. That's for sure.
Yeah, that's a fair distinction. Yeah. But it basically destroyed that sector of like the radical left in America that was gaining steam because it pacified the demands of labor in many ways. And if you think about it simply in terms of helping the material interests of those people who were protesting and building that movement, then you can see it as a good move. But if instead you look at it as a move that protected the long-term interests of a system that eventually gave us the financial collapse of 2008 and all of the other horrific things that we've seen as a direct result of neoliberalism, then in reality, it actually did a great deal of harm by allowing that system to persist and further ensconce itself within the system that we have. And I think that that's just a really interesting point of analysis where I think leftists and liberals very clearly differ in how they interpret those historical events.
Yeah, I do want to make it clear that I wouldn't be against the New Deal because it prolonged whatever communist revolution, and I actually don't think a communist revolution would have succeeded in America.
Right.
But it's not so much that I think I want the system to collapse, because it collapses already. The capitalist system collapses doesn't mean there'll necessarily be revolution or whatever.
Right.
I'm not like a economic determinist, but the way I would look at these things is the problem with the left today is they kind of and I'll say broadly, the popular left, the DSA specifically. Um, a lot of the commentators who prop up Bernie Sanders and the Squad and AOC, all of that, is they base their whole politics around sort of FDR type reformism, whereas the left that was pressuring people like FDR wasn't advocating for what FDR was doing. Not that they were against it, but they're advocating for something much more radical. Someone like Eugene Debs, for example, leader of the Socialist Party, was advocating for things like worker self-management and common ownership over the means of production. These are very much more radical things than just social security, which are great, by the way. All of these things are great. I would be happy if Biden was at least as ambitious with his programs as someone like FDR or Lyndon B. Johnson with the Great Society was. I'm not against these things, but to get these things, we have to look at the causes. And the left can't simply get these things by just merely demanding them. Right now, people like Bernie Sanders, who I would say, maybe that even if it's not their intention, what they would be doing in practice is sort of actually just making a nicer capitalism and prolonging the long-term interests of it. But we're not going to get that unless the short-term interests and long-term interests of capitalism are threatened. Why would the status quo tolerate a Bernie Sanders presidency, which frankly would result in lower profits for most corporations? Not just with his taxes, but really, I think the most radical part of Bernie's policy was having, I believe, that all the companies in the S&P 500, the top 500 companies, have to allocate 20% of their shares in a fund distributed to workers, owned by workers. That's the most radical part of his policy. That would not be something any capitalist system would accept unless they had the foot of the masses on their neck. That's the only way that would happen. Because I think if Bernie were to come to power and there wasn't broad support that was really threatening the capitalist system, Bernie would get cooed very easily, and they would get away with it. Or they would just do what they already did, which is like not let him win.
Yeah.
And we know like Bernie's election wasn't exactly fair. I'm not saying it was completely rigged, but there were certainly states where there was manipulation. We all know that.
Yeah, there was probably like a thumb on the scale somewhere that was already probably like the balance was disputable. Yeah, just to clarify my earlier point, I would I actually would I'm not suggesting that the New Deal was on balance a bad thing. I would be in favor of like a New Deal now and like say a Green New Deal. But just in terms of the broad picture, like 1,000-yard view of history, like which I don't necessarily advocate always taking, right? Like I think if you get into like the long-termism of a lot of that's in vogue now with a lot of billionaires and fascists, that leads to a lot of misery in the short term. But I do think it's useful to step back into that frame of view every now and again and sort of evaluate what the real long-term effects of those policies are. And ultimately, I think the New Deal did perpetuate the system. It helped to keep it.
It actually strengthened it.
Yeah,
it was the best golden age of capitalism came after that.
Yeah, and so it's useful to bear that in mind as we advocate for similar policies. I think that it would be like if you're advocating for like a Green New Deal, I think it's important to understand what the long-term ramifications of that will be, which is probably a strengthening of capital in the long term. Not to say that we shouldn't do it, because it will also result in better lives for the workers of America, but that wealth has to come from somewhere. And I think it's worth bearing in mind what the costs of those things are, even while we support them.
What do you mean the costs?
So, well, I mean, in terms of extracting wealth from the rest of the world, if I doubt that the Green New Deal would include provisions for, say, factory workers in Cambodia.
Okay. Yeah. So I would say one thing, social democracy doesn't require imperialism to work. Is because it's not the question is not the nominal money. The government, at least countries with currency sovereignty, can create as much money as they want. It's not the question about the money itself. It's about the resources. So yes, like a country that is exploited for labor. Yeah, if we didn't have global exploitation, we would be paying more for our goods for sure. So if that's what you mean by cost, 100%. Like we would be paying more for our iPhones, more for t-shirts and stuff like that, because that's like a real question, right? That like goes
Yeah.
back to the labor theory of value.
Right. Like we would need to onboard a lot of the things that we have heretofore put out into the world as like we don't really pay for like the externalities of a lot of the goods that we have in our country, in the
Mhm.
West. And you know, the reason that the t-shirt that I am wearing right now is $7 instead of 20 is because somebody somewhere suffered to make that happen. Um, and I think that that is something that we do need to be mindful of and consider when we start making sweeping changes to our economy. And there is this tendency in parts of the left, but specifically parts of like progressive liberalism, where there is just a focus on the internal well-being of the people in our country. Like there's a nationalist trend, and I worry when labor movements and worker movements are not global and inclusive of the people whom we extract value from.
Well, yeah, for sure. It makes sense from a purely rhetorical point of view to focus domestically, especially to rally up people kind
Mm,
of skeptical to leftist ideas. But I think largely socialism is impossible without being internationalist,
mm,
or else you end up like existing socialism. Part of the reason existing socialism is the way it is, like let's take Cuba for example, or USSR, or Yugoslavia, is if you have well, let's take now let's look at Cuba, right, for the sake of existing socialism, is if you don't have international trading partners, you're going to get sanctioned, embargoed by all the capitalist powers, because the bourgeoisie will not want a thriving socialist state. It's that simple, because then it'll set an example for other countries. And it's like, don't take it from me, take it from the CIA. There's plenty of documents about the on the operations to overthrow Cuba, that the fear about Cuba is not that it'll threaten America or anything. It's, at least now, it's literally that it's going to give an example to the rest of Latin America. Same with how Nixon and Kissinger felt about Salvador Allende in Chile. Is even though Allende's Chile was quote unquote democratic more than whatever Cuba, I disagree with how they define democratic. But the point being is they don't, it has to be internationalist, or else you're going to end up being a very insulated, isolated socialist state that has a lot of limitations. Like in Cuba, sure, they have a lot of amazing achievements, in many ways higher quality of life than many Latin American countries with their healthcare, education, and whatnot. But because they're very isolated from the rest of the world, they don't have access to a lot of essential resources that most countries do. You know,
mhm.
this the problem is, like, socialism just, and this, it's not nothing new. It's not a new discovery. I mean, Lenin and Marx were very clear that, you know, you need socialism to be international to to really reach its potential. Because I mean, not just to overthrow capitalism, but simply, like, there's the basic trade behind it. You know, it's not, trade isn't something exclusive to capitalism. It's virtually all of civilization. There's trade between countries to some extent. Some countries have stuff that other countries don't have. So not only should we care from a moral point of view about international workers, but it's also just, that's the only way it's really going to work.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess going back to a point that you mentioned earlier, in terms of like internal monetary policy and just in rhetorically focusing on the internal domestic population, I think that might be a good spot to get into the topic of your next video, and the deficit in modern monetary policy in terms of like why we could actually pay for those programs without much of an issue.
Okay, well, I mean, this is a question solved by Keynesians even when we had a gold standard. Now we're not on a gold standard. Before, the gold standard was when we had for every amount of money the government creates, it has to back it up in its reserves with gold. With banks, when they hold a certain amount of money in their bank reserves, they have to have the exact amount of gold. This is what existed for a long time, but it practically ended in 1933 after the Great Depression and Roosevelt's reforms. And it didn't officially end. It was taken off temporarily, and then they temporarily sort of brought it back after World War II. But it was officially taken off in 1971. Now, what does this mean? Why is this important? The gold standard was the only thing preventing the government from printing as much money as it wants. Now, it doesn't really print money anymore. It creates money digitally. Now, there's still other limitations to how much money the government can create, and that's inflation. But it's not anything else. It's not where are you going to get it. So this is what a lot of people get backwards. They talk about the debt. About if the government pays too much, what about the debt? Don't future generations have to pay the debt? Well, first off, the debt is in the government's own currency. Okay, if you were to start a country, you have your currency. Why would you want back the own currency you have?
Mm-hmm.
It sounds obvious, but okay, a lot of people don't consider the obvious is that it's not that taxes come first and then spending comes after. It's actually the spending comes first, the taxes come after.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll ask people, how does the government spend? Well, taxes, right? Where do the taxpayers get their money? They get it from firms. They get it from the wages. Well, where do the firms get it? From consumers. It's a circular loop. You can't actually get to where the money comes from. It comes from the government. And it's just an obvious fact. You look at any dollar bill, it'll say Bank of England in the case of the British pound, Bank of Canada in the case of Canada, or Federal Reserve note in the case of the US. That's where it comes from. So when there's a policy, the government doesn't go scrambling. And this is the case for all currency sovereign countries that they have their own currency, create all their spending in that currency, and issue all of their debt in that currency. Mm-hmm. So when a government spends an amount of money, it's not for a policy. Let's say take military spending. When it has a $80 billion bill in the U.S. to give to the Pentagon, and the Pentagon will make contracts to develop weapons, whatnot. How does it get that money? It doesn't go scrambling for taxes. It literally gets the Congress approves a budget. Now the Congress has that budget. Once it's approved, it gets the Federal Reserve to deposit the amount of money that it approves into the accounts of the necessary actors to make that policy happen. Literally on a screen. I mean, don't take it from me. Take it from the Federal Reserve chairman themselves. Jerome Powell, Ellen Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, all of the previous chairmen. They all admit this. There's interviews everywhere, and you'll see in my next video. That's how it's done. They don't go scrambling for taxes. Now, out of tradition, whenever they create a certain amount of money, they, quote unquote, issue debt. They create bonds for that amount of debt, which people can buy if they want. Now, the bonds aren't there because they need that money from the bonds, which, quote unquote, borrowed money, to use for that spending. No, that new money is already created. The point of the issued bonds is savings accounts. With savings accounts, you put, especially, I'll say it's really beneficial for the rich, but there's other uses for it. When people put money in a savings account, they get interest on it. This is good for, diversifying portfolios for people who are saving up for retirement, or rich people making investments, whatnot. And you get interest, which the government pays with newly created money on a screen, types it in. That's it, blah. Okay. Back in the day, they used to use, with the gold standard, they used to use some of that borrowed money to buy gold, which they would use to back up for money they created. That's no longer the case. Bonds are completely just savings accounts. And some cases, a bond's also good for inflation because, it's a way to not have money in the economy, encourage savings. So that when the economy is overheating, that's not really relevant right now because the problem is not, you don't need to encourage saving. If anything, saving's too high. Is another story. So the point being, okay, is that even progressives fall into this trap of thinking, okay, we need a tax to fund X. No, you don't. The taxes are only there to mitigate inflation. Now, you can have taxes for other purposes, like moral purposes, if you want to redistribute wealth for the sake of just having less inequality, right? That's a moral question. Or something, or you don't want rich people to influence politics. You want them to have less money. You have taxes, or taxes to deter certain behavior, like sin taxes, alcohol taxes, whatever. But it's not to fund things. Now, local governments do use taxes, and provincial governments use taxes to fund whatever their local programs are that they rely on. Because why? Because they can't create money. They don't have central bank. There isn't a Texas central bank. There's only a federal U.S. central bank. But still, you see these states usually run they usually run deficits often. And where do they get the rest of that money to fill that gap? From the federal government. There's always transfers all the time. So the point being is the big programs are always funded by newly created federal money. You have taxes there for a couple reasons, like I just said, inflation. But the biggest role of taxes is something people completely overlook. The role of taxes is what gives the currency its value. I'll ask you this question.
Yeah.
Fiat currency is literally it's a piece of paper without when it's not backed to gold, and and for the most part, it's on a computer, literally a number on a screen. What gives it value? Just out of curiosity, what do you think?
Well, I guess there's a couple ways to approach that. In terms of why, well, at the bedrock of it, it's that we all agree that it has value. So we agree that it is essentially a exchange rate for labor at a certain level of abstraction, right? It's this X number equates to this amount of somebody else's time, and we've agreed that that is a value store that we want to transact or use for transactions. But in terms of what makes that specific number worth that specific amount, I actually don't have an answer to that. I wouldn't even know how to hazard a guess.
Well, this is one of the traps a lot of people fall into. So even libertarians will accept. They'll be like, okay, yeah, fiat currency has no value, and the only thing that keeps it value is the fact that there's faith in the currency. Or some Marxists might say, Marxists who don't know as much about the monetary system, they'll say because of imperialism. And that's not what actually gives it value for the most part for currencies. It's taxes, because you need that currency to pay tax. What are the certainties in life? Death and taxes. Well, that's because that's just the nature of the state. The reason why you have that tax is to create demand for the dollars. Because let's say you want to own a home, you have to pay property tax. You can't just sit in your home all day or whatever, or do activities that don't make money. To get people, or if nobody had to pay taxes, the value of the currency would be dependent on like something like faith, or unless they were to tap it to a commodity of some sort like gold or silver. But no, it's the taxes. As long as people need money to pay taxes, there will always be value of the dollar. As to the exchange rate, that's a different thing. That's more determined by the demand for that currency globally, which is a wholly different matter, and it is less to do with the value. Like for example, you go to Japan, the currency is about. I've been in Japan about a year and a half ago, and roughly it's like 1,000 yen per every $100. That doesn't mean there's inflation. It's actually deflation. Inflation is the prices going up or down. It's not the value of the currency. The currencies can devalue in response to inflation, but it's not the other way around. It's not X causes Y, not X is Y. So like in the case of inflation, it's just prices going up continuously. So in the case of Japan, inflation's actually going down. There's deflation, which is usually a bad thing for a capitalist economy that wants prices to go up. To some degree, like a healthy degree of like 2%. And Japan actually has the highest debt to GDP in the world. Now, there'll be some people who would admit, they'll say, yeah, debt doesn't matter, but debt to GDP does. Actually, neither matter if you have money in your own currency. Japan has the highest debt to GDP in the world. Zero inflation. They have deflation. It doesn't matter. Their problem is real resources. The fact that their population is shrinking. The fact that they don't have much natural resources. These are the real constraints, always the real constraints. When the USSR created its probably, I would dare to say, the most successful housing program in history, after World War II, giving everybody a home. Not great homes, but still like better than being homeless, right? For a poor country after World War II, they didn't ask how we're going to pay for it. They created the money, got people to do the work.
Hmm.
As long as you have the people there to build the houses, that's what matters. It's not the nominal cost; it's the real cost. So for the wars, for example, libertarians will say we oppose wars because they cost trillions of dollars. That's not why we should oppose them. We should oppose them because they kill millions of people, right? Hundreds of thousands of people. The US the money that the US used to fund the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, they'll wipe their ass with that money. It doesn't matter. It's the real people. They can always afford as many wars as they want as long as they have the fuel and people. So this is the questions we should be asking. It's not about the debt. How are you going to find it? Progressives get completely backwards that they think they need this tax to pay for infrastructure, this tax to pay for healthcare, this tax to pay for that. China is out here building entire cities, having the finest infrastructure in the world, while having very, very low tax rates compared to the UK or even the United States.
So let me see if I can kind of summarize this to where I.
Sorry if that was a tangent. This is really hard to
No.
explain.
It's very interesting. I just want to make sure I understand everything that you just said, because there's a lot there that's kind of interconnected. But like fundamentally, what you're saying is that fiat currency, the money that we have, is essentially just imaginary, right? It's a number on a computer, and when the government goes to pay for something, there's not like a balance sheet where you have to take, like, for instance, if I were going to make a decision about how to purchase something, I'm not going to take money out of one account and put it in another account, and like that's a real number that I have to contend with. They figure out how much it's going to cost, and they create that money, and then that gets issued as like bonds or other sorts of things, but those don't actually pay for it. That is an investment asset for other people. And the purpose of taxes, theoretically, is to pay for that after the fact. But fundamentally, what taxes serve as two primary functions. One is
taxes don't pay anything. Like the federal taxes don't pay anything.
Okay, so
the bond payments, that's also created. Like like a big part of the U.S. budget, for instance, is Social Security payments and bond interest payments. They just type numbers on the screen. That's how they do it.
Okay, so then the primary purpose of taxes then is twofold. One, to prevent inflation by removing circulating currency, and then two, to provide an impetus for the currency to have value, because at the end of the day, everyone will still need to have some of it in order to pay those taxes, regardless of any other consideration. Is that?
That's right.
Okay. What would I'm trying to think of like counter arguments to that, just for the like sake of like devil's advocacy.
If you have a gold standard, you need the taxes to pay for the gold, which you use to back up the money you're creating.
Yeah.
Or sometimes if taxes aren't enough to offset that, which they almost never are, they borrow, right? So that's what they used to do. But ever since we gone off the gold standard, that's not what the purpose of borrowing is. It's literally just savings accounts. I mean, we could do away with bonds completely, like government federal bonds. We could do away with completely, but we have them as savings accounts because it's for people who are retirees. Also, if you're really rich, it's essentially like free money. And the economist Warren Mosler, big MMT, modern monetary theory economist, he calls it UBI for the rich, because what a bond is, it's basically a risk-free asset. When you're investing in government bond, there's absolutely zero risk the government won't make the payment. Because the government, it's paying it in its own currency. It can't run off its own currency. It's not paying it in pesos or yen or something. It's paying it in US dollars if you're investing in US bonds. So it's always going to make the payment. So it's effectively like free money if you are collecting a lot of interest on that. Now, interest payments are low as shit right now because of like, this is to encourage more borrowing as opposed to saving, because the economy is like actually in like a very declining phase for a lot of the world, especially the United States. But, at one point under Reagan, actually, the interest rates were extremely high, sometimes as high as 20% at their very peak. Can you imagine what rich people are getting on that?
Yeah. Which I think the this kind of like feeds into, and I think you mentioned this as well, the idea that you didn't just mention it, you spoke at length about this, that really fundamentally what the economy is your resources and your labor pool. And that everything else is kind of an abstraction up from that. But if you have the resources and you have the labor, you can do the thing. And there's no real reason not to, particularly if your only reason not to is a number on a screen somewhere, right? Like we could do the things that we want because we have the resources to do them and we have the people to make it happen. The idea that some number will be in a parenthetical statement looking red on some balance sheet somewhere is not really an actual argument against doing these things that would make everybody's lives better. Is that the kind of the gist of it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we can create money. We can't create tanks just like that, right?
Mhm.
It takes real resources to build that. So with something like let's say a infrastructure bill that Biden's been trying to pass, it's not about where you get the money. This is a bunch of nonsense, absolute nonsense. The biggest reason why people like Joe Manchin oppose it's not really because they're so fiscally responsible. The reason why Joe Manchin opposes a bill like that is because he gets a lot of donations from fossil fuels. And part of Biden's Build Back Better is also a climate bill. You know, you're building a lot of green solar energy, wind energy, nuclear. I believe nuclear energy too. And you know, people who are in favor of fossil fuels obviously don't like that.
Mhm.
It's why do the biggest contradiction is how come they always ask about universal health care, a basic income, or a jobs program, social security? Where are we going to find the money? But they don't ask that about wars. They don't ask that about tax cuts. You know, Republicans actually run such high deficits partly because they just cut taxes so much. If they gave a damn about that, they wouldn't be doing that. They would be asking the question, "Oh, how are you going to pay for all of this? How are you going to pay for it?" It's because they know most people who are in power, they at this point know we're on a fiat currency system. You'll have really like crazy people who are really extremely dumb who believe the myth, like Rand Paul, you know,
Mhm.
um, who will really believe like in the debt stuff. But most people in power, they don't take it that seriously, and that's why they only ask the questions when it comes to stuff like healthcare. Actually, in the case of healthcare, let's say, okay, the only things you should be asking when it comes to building a policy, a project, whatever it is do you have the real resources available, and could this cause inflation? And if it were to cause inflation, what can we do to mitigate that inflation? Like, let's say like price controls. In the case if you do UBI, you have like some sort of rent control or something,
Mhm.
because they can just jack up rents. Like, what's the point of UBI then? But let's take healthcare. In the case of healthcare, not only do we have the resources available, it's actually cheaper, more efficient, and deflationary because it brings down prices. It brings down prices because obviously, like if it's a universal healthcare system, it's going to be cheaper than the private for-profit system, and it also allows people to spend goods and service more money on other things. Right? It's
Yeah.
a deflationary event. Same with like a housing program. Actually, you'll see there's an article written by the Wall Street Journal a while ago that was warning against Bernie Sanders' public housing program because it would be deflationary for the housing market, and that's because Wall Street Journal is for real estate investors, stock investors, and public housing program is a nightmare for real estate investors because it'll bring down the value of all their properties. It's a nightmare for landlords.
Yeah.
So we always got to keep these things into consideration.
Yeah. No, I mean that's an excellent point. Um I'm looking forward to that video. That sounds like it's a very fascinating subject, and I don't want to spoil it anymore for people. I think that's an excellent preview for it, and I'll just encourage everybody to watch that when it comes out. And it should have been out by the time this episode airs, so everybody go check that out.
Speaking
Yeah,
of which, can I just add one more thing?
yeah, absolutely.
I mentioned bonds being UBI for the rich. That might seem a bit like outlandish for some people, but take it from rich people themselves, like Warren Buffett. I have a video on Warren Buffett called "The Socialism of Warren Buffett: How the Stock Market Works." Kind of like a joke, but Warren Buffett at the start of the video, he literally says, people talk about welfare mothers, welfare queens. When the rich have their welfare, it's called bonds.
Yeah.
So take it from him. Take it from the proof is in the pudding with all these things. It's some people like to straw man say modern monetary theory is some crazy theory that it's like niche, but in reality, it's just saying what a lot of people know. It's just articulating it more clearly and in the lines of like a broader economic ideology. Whereas a lot of like what is dominates economics still is like neoclassical, neoliberal economics, like, largely Chicago school stuff, Milton Friedman. It doesn't include that at all. Like, it deliberately ignores that.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's no clearer evidence, I think, than the fact that past a certain threshold of money, you just get more money for virtue of having it, um, in a sort of self-perpetuating cycle. Like, if you have enough liquid assets to dump into, say, a Vanguard fund, you're done. Like, that's it. You'll just accumulate money for the rest of your life at an ever increasing pace because of the way the system works, just by having it sitting in an account doing nothing. Um, so I uh, I think that is probably a good place to break off from there. And I encourage everybody to watch both of those videos, the Socialism of Warren Buffett as well, and the new one that you're going to come out with. But I want to get into the other subject that I think you and I both have thought a great deal about, which is automation. And this comes with the labor pool thing. And the reason, and I'll just kind of tell you why I'm worried about this and think about this so much. And then maybe we can get some conversation going from there. But the way I look at it, the only mechanism by which the working class can exert control, like can exert power, can force change, like we talked about earlier, is with, the reduction of their labor. They can withhold their labor. They can say, we're not going to work anymore. And that can force a change in the capitalist class because they don't have a way to generate wealth if somebody's not going to work for them. Now, with increasing automation, which should be a good thing, right? Theoretically, we could have a world where most work is done by AI or robots or what have you, and that we all kind of share in the bounty of that and people work less. The problem is that we don't have a democratically controlled economy, and the people who are going to own these systems, who are going to own the the machines and the AIs who do the work, uh, are going to be the capitalist class. They're going to be the billionaires. They're going to be people who create a company that builds a machine that does all the stuff that X worker used to do and replace an entire industry of people. And so you're going to have systems where there's kind of the pathway forward as we're currently on is that the capitalist class could theoretically own a source of labor that is not actual human beings, and that the people who currently do work will no longer have power anymore. They won't be able to withhold work because the work will be done by automation. And so that to me is a prime motivator in seeking democratic control of the economy now, so that those systems of automation that will develop in the future will be collectively owned and we will all reap the benefits of them, rather than living in some sort of hellhole where like a small handful of people control not only the means of production, but the actual labor used to produce. And then everybody else gets just enough money not to revolt in some sort of like feudalistic hellhole UBI type situation. And those are divergent paths we could go down, but I think they solidify the further you go down them. So I think now is the moment where we really need to start thinking about this, and we really need to get an organized labor movement together to democratize our economy before that happens. Because I think there's a risk of real catastrophe if we don't.
So yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think automation, along with climate change, is sort of one of those do or die issues that really
Mm-hmm.
will lead us into either socialism or barbarism. And I do not trust automation under capitalism. I mean, there's a lot of Elon Musk techno utopians who think that automation is just going to magically happen and we're going to get UBI and everything's going to be great. We're going to get Teslas and we're all going to have Apple Watches, whatever. Yeah. So the thing is, I do not. I think there's a couple of things to look at. Is automation, like you said, obviously, and like I show in my video, depends on who owns it and whether it's an economy that is democratically managed and planned. I do not trust whatsoever a system in which there's private ownership over these robots. We need to have common ownership over automation and technologies and democratically decide how we use them. This is super crucial because not only can we use these technologies to more emancipatory ends, we can also prevent them from doing the opposite of what we want them to do. Right now, automation isn't really being used to liberate humans. It's actually used to make us work harder. We have all these surveillance tracking mechanisms like in Amazon to make people more productive. And it's essentially within the pool of labor of jobs that exists, it is making it harder to actually get jobs, right? And because of that, workers have to compete with each other, and employers can lower down wages. Now, there's some disruptions to this with sort of what we see with COVID, because a lot of countries have been getting stimulus checks of some kind. What this allows is it essentially gives workers more bargaining power, allows them to leave the workforce. This is why I see UBI, even under a capitalist system, it won't be great. Certainly not a solution, and it's not. But I still see UBI as good because it could give workers leverage. I think, if anything, the stimulus checks have showed us that that's literally what they can do. They can.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they'll pacify the masses. UBI will actually allow workers to more mobilize and allow to think about what they really want to do, what kind of work they really want to do, and to reject nonsense work.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think per se that I want to make it clear with automation, while it is indeed happening, it's not so much that automation is why we don't have jobs. I'm not sure if I got that across in the video as well as I'd like to. Even though automation is happening, it's not so much why there's a shortage of jobs. Automation certainly has the capability of automating jobs, but that's not the largest reason why there's a lack of things to do. There's not a lack of things to do. There's plenty of things to do. There's just a lack of paid work because the economy is, number one, stagnating, and capitalism is incredibly inefficient at allocating resources and what things we need to do. So, like, this is why in America you have a pool of all these bullshit administrative jobs, all these advertising agencies, all these nonsense private insurance companies, middlemen companies with healthcare firms, so much bureaucracy, so much nonsense that the system creates. Meanwhile, America's roads, and I would argue Canada's roads, suck too. They're like Baghdad. It's embarrassing, for a first world country. So, like, you have this total failure of capitalism. You have, instead of a research being put into antibiotics, you have fucking poop emoji pool floats being built. Like, you just have complete misallocation of resources. So the thing is I think what we need is actually a mix of UBI and a sort of job guarantee, that a job guarantee is very specifically tailored for things we need to do, like building roads. And what this will do is the UBI is good so people don't like starve to death, can pay for essential things like food and to live, right?
Mm-hmm.
We need these things, I think. Although you can address part of like housing just with the public housing program that take longer to build. And for those who want to, buy more, who want to consume more, live more lavishly, they have to work more. I think that's only fair. I think that's a Marxist principle, actually, is like to each according to their ability, to each according to their need. It's not equality of outcome. It's not what Marxism ever was. It's just you take care of people's needs first. People who want to live better lives than each other, well, it's on what you do. I think that's only fair. And we should give people the ability to be employed. So like a job guarantee is important. Like you have that deliberately targets the unemployed who private firms do not want to hire. But I don't trust this process really on a current neoliberal system whatsoever.
Yeah.
So under a neoliberal system, I think if we have a job guarantee, they'll just create jobs that like are completely nonsense. That will just be like bureaucracy that no one needs. And this is the problem: is we need like a more economic planning. I don't mean like a quote unquote command economy where the government like decides everything, plans everything. No, but I think for essential things, you need planning, and it's not like capitalist countries that are, I'll say, market-based economies can have also planning. Like the US used planning, Britain used planning during World War II. China has had massive success with planning. It's part of why their capitalism has been way more successful than probably I would say any country in history. I mean, that's just fair to say. Because they'll be like, okay, do we need to build roads? Do we need trains? Okay, let's build them. There isn't let the market decide. That never happens. You'll have a market decide to build a train. It won't ever happen. So
yeah.
you need planning to address these concerns. As to a capitalist system, I mean, that's a really difficult question. I don't trust a job guarantee in a capitalist system, at least a neoliberal based system that doesn't involve planning. I would take a UBI. I'd be skeptical of a UBI though, just if they try to Trojan horse some sort of like austerity with it by cutting, let's say, Social Security or cutting welfare programs. But I don't think it makes sense to do that, because if one were to do UBI, I feel like one has to effectively believe in MMT, because even though people like Andrew Yang purport to be some sort of centrists, or Elon Musk, that they're not, they don't believe in this stuff, and they kind of sometimes reinforce the deficit myth. In reality, for UBI to be feasible, you have to kind of accept that the government can just create money. Because the idea of like having taxes to pay for UBI is stupid. It's just completely stupid. Why would you want to pay more in taxes to have a UBI? Like, unless they're going to tax the rich, but we know that's not going to happen under this. If it's like a Elon Musk UBI, because they're not going to tax. Look at Elon Musk now. He won't even accept Biden's taxes, like Biden's modest tax increases. So I would say like we should accept a UBI because it'll allow labor to organize better. And it will also, thinking about the bigger questions, and this is what I tried to promote a lot in the Planet of the Robots video, is I think the vision of a socialist movement of the 21st century should be a post-work movement. It shouldn't be like this old school proletarianism, factory workers unite, because most people don't work in factories anymore. And the thing is not even the sad thing is like most, it seems that in first world countries that are deindustrialized, a lot of the work doesn't even matter. And the work, there is tons of work that does matter still, right? But that doesn't make up the majority of the electorate. There's still like a whole class of people who don't really feel like proletarians, even if they are in a Marxist sense. In a Marxist sense, working class just means that you make the majority of your money from labor, as opposed to from like rents or stocks or ownership in a company, etc. So, but the problem is like one who works a BS advertising job probably doesn't feel like a proletarian in the same way that a paramedic or a healthcare worker or a factory worker or a waitress feels. Those jobs are much more direct. You can feel the exploitation, the underpaid aspects of it much more. But the thing is, though, that's not the majority of the electorate. So what unites people, I think, is free time. Having more free time, being able to have basic needs met. Okay, we want affordable housing. We want to have like affordable housing like Austria, quality, nice public housing that we don't have to go into debt to live or spend all of our wages on. Stuff like this kind of unites people, this push towards more free time. Now, post-work doesn't mean not working at all. Like that's obviously impossible. But the point is that you don't have to like work to starve. Because then how can we say we live in a free society if we have to work just to like exist? Right? I think if one wants to have the services of others, like, you want to buy this expensive computer that takes a lot of labor to make, or you want to buy this t-shirt, clothes that take a lot of labor to make. Yeah, you have to work to earn that. I think that's only fair. That's Marxist. But to say that one has to work just to exist, that's not, how much have we really moved past slavery at that point?
Yeah. The way I've generally defined my politics, I've been trying to get it down to like an elevator pitch. And the way that I've kind of pared it down is I think that every person, simply by virtue of being a human being, deserves free and equal access to the things that are necessary for survival, so food, shelter, medicine, and the things that are necessary for meaningful participation in their society. So,
Mhm.
communication, transportation, education. Those things should be provided. You shouldn't have to work for them. You shouldn't have to do anything. You just get them. And then if you want anything else, well, there's work to be done still. So
Mhm.
we can go do that. That's kind of that's just kind of where I fit. Now, there are I phrase it in that way because it is kind of sneaky, where I can get most progressive liberals to agree to that. And then I can tell them, well, now here's why that doesn't actually work under your economic system. And maybe we should start thinking about some other stuff, because the long term, you know, like say, like Elon Musk is not going to do that, right? Like the people that want to provide that sort of thing under um, austerity politics and private ownership of our economy are they're going to give people just enough so that they don't destroy the system. They're not going to give them enough to where they can actually have a comfortable, happy life. Like, I don't think that people should be barely subsisting. Like, when I say you should have everything you need to be a happy, healthy person, I mean that literally. Like, you should be able to just have enough that you can vibe for the rest of your life, from the time you're born to the time you're dead. And if you want more than that, then you can work for it, but you shouldn't have to struggle just to exist comfortably. And that breaks down under a system that requires people's labor to function.
There is also something so many people tend to miss when it comes to the question of labor, and that is the unpaid labor. All the unpaid labor people do all the time, like
Mm-hmm,
housework, um, family work, so much stuff we do that isn't paid.
mm-hmm,
We never consider this stuff, like emotional labor, right?
mm-hmm,
Um, this is why I do think we need a basic income, is because, okay, people who have big family, that's a job on its own. Why should, it's actually really psychologically bad for a mother of even like two or even one sometimes to have to work 9 to 5 and not take care of their kid. The kid gets emotionally fucked. Anyone who knows basic psychology knows that if kids don't get enough attention when they're young, they have a lot of neurosis when they're older. I mean,
mm-hmm,
it's just basic psychology. So if we want to care about mental health, it's not going to be this neoliberal privatized nonsense about like buying Jordan Peterson books or whatever. We need to get to the root of it, and part of that is labor.
mm-hmm,
So we need to have people the ability to for people to have families, and this is how one of the biggest talking points I like to give to conservatives is, okay, you care about family values, you can't be a capitalist. Simple as possible. And I mean, some people think family values like it's just like there's a lot of weird bigoted
mm-hmm.
connotation with it, or sexist connotation or transphobic connotation. They're like, oh, it's like heterodox ideology. But people sometimes people genuinely just they care about family stuff. So that's why I think it has a broad appeal. And they
Mm-hmm.
think, oh, the left wants to take away your family. And often, left rhetoric has been used to sort of pioneer a capitalist agenda. Like, for example, in America, they used feminism to kind of, so get more women to work, because it's like, oh, just push them in the labor force. Yay, more money, capitalism. But
Yeah.
the truth is you need male or female, whatever the gender, you need parents to be able to be there for their kids, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And like this is where I think family is important. And to do, how do you facilitate that? You don't facilitate that by bringing back religion or some bullshit that's like symbolic, right? It's real and tangible and material. And I think a basic income is one of the best ways to do that for like um, a family, and it's not just a family, but I say universal basic income because means tested programs are awful. Anyone
Mm-hmm.
who's ever tried to apply for them knows
Mm-hmm.
they're horrible. They make you feel horrible, inferior. They make it so hard to get these payments. I believe in a universal program. There's no fiscal restraint to why, as long as we have price controls on basic things. Um, Maybe even a tax, if you really need to. But there's no reason we can't afford it. I think these things are important for also just further kinds of labor that aren't commodifiable. So I'm a bit biased to this because I kind of consider myself, even though it's not what I do full time as my real, quote unquote, real job, but I'm in the creative class. I mean, you are too. You host a podcast, right?
Yeah.
Is we wish we could just do this full time, like making
Yeah.
videos and stuff. It is hard work. Like people, it's actually, I do more work for my YouTube than my real job, even though I get paid nothing except for my Patreon from my YouTube practically. And
I would say that as well.
Yeah, and with my real job, I get paid like way more, but I feel like I actually do far less impact. So the point being is, why can't we start thinking that stuff like arts that matters too? That's work, and the thing is that's the market is just isn't going to reward that. It simply can't. It's impossible to. So like a basic income is good for those reasons too. This is a thing that even like some hardcore old school Marxists, I'll say old school Marxists, don't consider is that. Like we need some sort of environment that allows creativity and arts to flourish. So the only way that is, I think I can only see that with like affordable housing and a basic income. Because if you want to, you shouldn't be able to be a starving, there shouldn't be starving artists, okay? Like if you want to do that, you should be allowed to do it. Now, if you want to, I don't know, buy expensive t-shirts or whatever, or stuff that takes a lot of other labor to make, it only makes sense that, okay, you take on some extra work somewhere to go make the money to do that. In a purely socialist society, you'd have something like labor vouchers instead of money, because labor vouchers, I mentioned that in the video, extinguish as soon as you use them. You use them for a purpose. Like you have a labor voucher that's worth this much amount of labor, use it, it perishes right away. But that's a bigger question. We could even do this with an existing system, even in a social democracy, I would argue. It's just more feasible in a socialist system where workers, I would say working class rather, not the capitalist class, are essentially like, they are the collective, I don't like to use the word dictatorship, but they are the collective, they control the society. Whereas I say the society now it's basically a dictatorship of capital, the dictatorship of capitalism. Because who really has Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, whatever, is capitalists who ultimately make the laws. So we want a society where workers make the laws. This is more possible in that society.
Yeah, the way that I've often thought about it, and this goes back to having democratic control over things like emerging automation and things like that. The way I've thought about it is in the transition from feudalism to, like mercantile capitalism and liberal democracy, the Enlightenment and all that jazz, there was this idea that we should dissolve the power of feudal lords and monarchs, and we should take that and dissolve it amongst the people. Now, in reality, that wound up being a particular class of people, which was the capitalist class largely. But the idea was to dissolve the power of the state amongst the individual people so that they had control over their own lives. And I like that idea. I'm a fan of it. I just think we should keep doing it, and we should extend that into the economy. Like what the Enlightenment proposed or purported to have done, what the Enlightenment is purported to have done to political power, I think that we should continue that process and do it to our economy as well. It's really just taking the next step, is how I view the whole constellation of leftist theory, is going one step further and dissolving economic power amongst the populace as well.
Well, I would even go further to say that liberalism doesn't even really give power to the people. I have a whole podcast on liberalism that goes over one of my favorite books called Liberalism, A Counter History by the Italian thinker Domenico Losurdo. And really, the project of liberalism wasn't all that emancipatory. I mean, it was really the merchant class, the emerging bourgeois class that just overthrew the kings because they were sick of taxes and they wanted to have no restriction on the amount of slaves they can own. I mean, it's not that complicated. I mean, that's really what happened. And they when they talk about liberty and being against slavery, they're talking about liberty to have as many slaves as they want and treat them however they want to, and have as much property as they can. Believe it or not, under kings, there's a lot of restrictions. It's not mean feudalism is a worse system than capitalism, not for the reasons people often think, but it's an objectively worse system. But it's not like under capitalism, democracy is something exclusive to capitalism. Quite the contrary. The idea of limited government was because they were sick of the aristocracy taxing all of the wealth that the merchants were bringing from overseas, like all the gold they were taking from Latin American countries, exterminating indigenous people, etc. So what we hear this stuff, equality, liberty, freedom, right? What is the job, I think, of a left movement today is to actually make those things real.
Yes.
Like, I don't know, but equality is a little bit weird to me because I don't even like to speak in those terms. Usually Marx doesn't either, because equality is kind of ambiguous. Like, I think we should be equal under the law, which we supposedly are, but we all know that's not true.
Yeah.
I mean, the trials we see all the time, but versus like white people and black people who commit similar crimes, like that's just proof of that. But I think equality of outcome is impossible. I mean, Marxism never argues for equality of outcome. Like, it's just a weird thing to measure. But I would say, the egalitarian might be a better way to say it. Democratic, in the sense that, like, it's. But people think democratic is simply the amount of parties you have. That's not what democratic is. That's like saying, oh, we are free based on the different flavors of Oreos we get. That's not democratic. Democratic is whether people have the ability to influence their own destiny and their own government or their own society. If you're anarchist, don't want a government. But that's a point. So, like, I think that, like you said, the democratic management of the means of production, that's socialist by definition. That can't be capitalist, because capitalist entails private ownership of the means of production. And with that's by its nature going to be a minority, and the interests of the capitalist owning class and the workers will always be opposed. Anyone who tries to say promote class collaborationism, like this isn't the case, is completely delusional or lying, because let's say the basic facts, okay, landlords want rent to go up. Renters, tenants want rent to go down. Simple.
Yeah. I almost think the equality of outcome thing is something of like a canard that like got invented by conservatives as a rhetorical point, because I don't really know of any, like, I'm sure there are a few leftist theorists who advocate for that in the extreme position, but like in terms of just like general discourse and like talking to lefties, like I don't really know anybody who actually really advocates for that in like serious terms. Like, I think what most people want is they want democratic control of their economy. They want to have a say in how things are done. And if you want to, I don't know of too many people who would say if you want to work a little bit harder, you shouldn't get a little extra in return for that, so long as everybody has their basic needs met.
One thing I think where a lot of the confusion lies is that, yes, Marxists are, and like by and large, most socialist anarchists as well, are more egalitarian. And what I think the confusion lies, it's not equality of outcome per se, but it's classlessness. And I think what some people think, oh, classlessness, doesn't that mean equality of outcome? No, not really. But classless, I would look at it this way. You look at feudalism, there was all these different weird arbitrary classes. Feudalism, there was aristocrats, the king, queen, there was knights, there was all little hierarchies here and there. They're very arbitrary. In capitalism, it's very simplified basically to workers, capitalists, and some people might add in the labor aristocracy, which are like the more well-paid workers, which are usually a minority, like doctors and lawyers, people like that, professional managers, etc. But in capitalists, it's not about how rich you are. That's not really what classes are. Because like Warren Buffett, for example, and I don't know, let's look at someone else, Donald Trump, even though Warren Buffett is astronomically wealthier than Trump, they're the same class. It's because they're both capitalists, right? Even a small business owner, if that's or a landlord who's not particularly super wealthy, they're still capitalists. The point is that they make money from other people's labor or rent extraction, from ownership of something, or they make it from labor. The idea of a socialism is that there's one class, the laboring class, and eventually the laboring class is abolished. Then you have no classes. This doesn't mean equality of outcome, because people who obviously there will always be differences that are somewhat, there'll be ableist things, right? Like where some people might have disabilities, they'll have greater needs and have a lesser ability to, quote unquote, work more to get extra leisure. And then there'll also be the more, quote unquote, meritocratic discrepancies, where maybe people legitimately work harder and they do more labor, they put more hours in, and they get more from the social wealth of society.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's normal, but there's still classlessness. But what it means is not equality of outcome. Because how can one, for example, like should people someone who grows up in a family of 5, takes care of a family of 5, versus a family of 2, should they get entitled to the same things? No, right? There's no equality of outcome there. It doesn't make sense. It's needs that make sense, right? So a lot of, like you said, a lot of conservatives and liberals, they'll agree with the idea, teach according to their ability, teach according to their need, but they don't usually know who that quote is from.
Yeah. I think the big thing for me in terms of why I am a proponent of let's just not use scary words like communism or socialism, but why I'm in favor of democratic control of the economy is we have now, in terms of board members of these massive companies like Google and Facebook and like the S&P 500, right? There are how many people, the people on the boards of those companies who are able to make decisions. There's probably less than 5,000 of those people, and those 5,000 people can individually or collectively make decisions that completely change the material conditions of millions, if not billions of people. And they are completely unaccountable to those people in every way. And they are unaccountable by design. The system as it exists doesn't work if they're accountable. So you have this huge concentration of power, right? Not just economic power, but political power into the hands of unelected people who are completely unaccountable to the world, just because they happen to be on the board of some company somewhere. And I think that when you think about it in terms of the control and the power that those people who are unelected can exert on the world, I think that starts to crystallize for some people a little bit more what we're talking about, right? Like, I don't care that somebody is wealthy, right? I don't give a shit. I don't care if somebody wants to drive a BMW or, a Beamer, or have like a really, a big house or something. If you want to work harder than me and get those things, sure, fuck it. I don't care as
I
long as
do.
everybody can eat.
I don't think anyone should have like a house the size of a university. Like, I'll say that.
Okay, all right, that's fair. But if you want to have like 6 bedrooms or whatever, right? Like, I don't care about like the minor signifiers of wealth and like the things that I think like I don't care if you want to have a McMansion, right? But what I do care about is if somebody can individually exert massive change or exert control and create huge changes in other people's lives, and those people don't have a say in that. And that is what essentially the economy that we have is under the current, like under the current system. And that's what I really have a problem with.
Yeah, well, this is the whole thing. Is I think I get why not we shouldn't use the word maybe communism just because of the Red Scare propaganda associated with that. But I still use the word socialism because I think it's like important to make it clear that democratic management over the economy might, for example, it might not happen with socialism, right? You can get like some kind of bureaucratic aristocracy, that's possible,
Mm-hmm.
but having a democratic management over the economy is impossible with capitalism. It's just
Yes.
impossible. Like it's even with social democracy, it's impossible. And that's because simply, if you have a system of private ownership and investment, okay, let's say, I talk about this really in length in my video on Warren Buffett and the stock market. Let's say you want to own shares of Tesla. What is it at? Like $1,000 a share? But if I'm given like $10 million, I can buy way more shares, profit way more on the rises in the stock price versus someone who has, I don't know, $10,000. Easy,
Yeah.
simple like that. And who is there any work involved in that? No, right? And I think Warren Buffett, one of the pinnacle of one of the card carrying capitalists, he says it himself. He says he was asked, "Do billionaires work harder?" And he said, "Well, I know some who work very hard. I know some who don't do a goddamn thing, like myself."
Yeah.
And that's important to really consider. Is you can't have with a system of private ownership. It's just impossible to have And what I want to also make it clear, there's some people who think who might watch a little bit of Richard Wolff lectures, they might get the wrong idea or miss what he's really saying. And it's not like, okay, the solution isn't just have more worker co-ops per se, because if that's alongside capitalism, that's only going to do so much. You need a system where basically there's always going to be industries in society that are going to have a public monopoly. Like let's look at water, right? A nation's water reserves, or a nation's emerald mines, or mining facilities of some other resource, cobalt, whatever it is, stuff it's a public monopoly.
Right.
Or something like, even like, say, Walmart. Walmart has somewhat of a monopoly on like general retail. The solution to those type of huge industries is not to make them worker cooperatives. It's to make them democratically managed collective enterprises. So then I like to use that word instead of government ownership, because people think government ownership by its nature is like, or state ownership is like by its nature undemocratic. It can be undemocratic and it doesn't have to be, right? But the point is like certain stuff with a monopoly, the fruits of it should be collectivized as opposed to just like the people there. Because like, let's look at because it's a monopoly, it's predicating on something everybody needs. It's inelastic demand. It makes no sense to have it private owned, even if it's a worker owned thing. Like let's look at yeah, like why should a worker co-op replace Nestle? Nestle should be publicly owned. Right? Or not Nestle, first of all, Nestle shouldn't be interfering in anyone's water reserves like that are outside of Switzerland.
Yeah.
There's a Swiss company. It should be like, let's say a Canadian publicly owned company, or where I live, should own our water reserves, right? Indigenous in a lot of whatever. I almost maybe go on a tangent about like how Canada treats its Indigenous people. That's a whole different other story.
Yeah, but, that's a whole podcast on itself. Yeah. We'll just like insert here, go research land back, and all of the ways that Canada is a horrible genocidal colonialist state, and America too. Yeah, we'll just asterisk that and move on.
But I want to say, so like that doesn't mean that everything should be like collectivized per se, right? There's some things like that are inelastic demand, that are leisure products, called non-essential services or non-essential goods. I think that makes sense to be controlled by worker co-ops. Like you don't want to collectivize restaurants. Like why would that make any sense? Right. You have a worker-owned restaurant, right? We're different worker-owned restaurants coexisting in a healthy way. Why not? Because what people forget, small business isn't necessarily better than big business if it's capitalist. Anyone who's worked in a big enterprise versus a small business knows exactly. Sometimes small businesses are worse. A lot of the times the restaurants especially are horrible, right? The point is the undemocratic aspect. If you work at a restaurant, for example, small or big, the boss can fire you, he can treat you however he wants.
Yeah.
So you have a democratically managed and owned business, right? For something like that, like worker cooperatives, I think are good for small enterprises, things that or non-essential services, things that have a public monopoly and inelastic demand need to be collectively owned, right? And that doesn't mean they're democratic or not. I think they should be democratic, but the point is like it doesn't have to be like a weird bureaucratic top-down Stalinist thingy, Like it can be collectively like managed, democratic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm mindful of your time. I know we're coming up on where you said you had to bounce, so I think that might be a good spot to end it on that note. One Dime, do you want to tell everybody where they can find you and where you are online and how they can watch all these awesome videos?
Yeah, so I run a channel called One Dime, letter number one, and then dime, DIME, just like that. Yeah, I would go check out the channel. I have around 15,000 subscribers as of now. I would check out probably the video that might be out as you're listening to this called The Deficit Myth. That's definitely the one that deals a lot of the matter we're talking about today. Planet of the Robots is another good one. Burnout Society. Why Billionaires Prefer Democrats. Those are videos I'm very proud of.
Mhm.
Also, there's a bunch of others we could talk about. Like I know Mark really likes Acid Communism. I like that one too.
Yeah,
Although that one's a little
we
bit
didn't
more
get to
niche.
that, but I'll
A
actually
little more
plug.
niche.
Yeah, I'll plug your because you have a podcast as well on a
That's
second
true. Yeah,
channel.
I have a podcast called One Dime Radio where I go over more like the stuff I do on my channel, but more in depth, more theoretical.
Yeah, and I will plug not only the video Acid Communism that you did, but the conversation that you had with Chill Goblin about that, and the QAnon conspiracy was a really good
Oh yeah,
convo.
New Age conspirituality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So both of those are fan favorites of mine. So go check those out. And then you got your Twitter. That'll actually be up on the screen and in the show notes. Is there anywhere else that people can find you that you want to plug?
That's about it. And if you really like my videos, support me on Patreon. Support anyone who you like support Mark's podcast on Patreon. Support anyone who you think is like a creative, if you have the means to do so, right?
Right.
Who you think makes good creative stuff. This is good because right now, we don't get basic income, we don't get affordable housing. It sucks for creatives out here. So the support's really meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, everybody go sub to One Dime's Patreon and then throw me $1 if you got any left. All right, man. I had a blast. That was real fun. Thanks for coming on the show. Everybody, One Dime.
For sure. Thanks. Happy to be on.
Hey, everybody. Mark Edwards again, and I want to thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. I want to say a special thank you to all of my patrons whose names are on the screen now. As One Dime and I mention and talk about at the end of this episode, support from viewers is really important for people who produce creative works like this show. And it really means a lot to me when folks are able to donate recurringly. So I want to thank you again for that. If you're able to become a patron and support what I do here, it would mean the world to me. You'll get your name up on the screen. You'll also get early access to all of my content as well. If you want to give a one-time donation, you can do so via Ko-fi, PayPal, and Venmo, all at Ultraviolet Pod. If you are not able to support the show financially, then please consider upvoting it on YouTube, subscribing to my channel there, give it a 5-star rating on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a comment if you're able to. All of that really helps with the algorithm. It really helps me get the word out, and it brings in more viewers, and that helps me immensely as well. If you'd like to follow me on social media, you can do so on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Ultraviolet Pod. If you would like to communicate with me directly, you can reach me at ultravioletpod@gmail.com. And I just want to say thank you again to everybody that donates and takes the time to watch what I do here. It really means a lot to me, and I really, really appreciate it. And thank you again, and I will see you on the next one.